Welcome to the Art of Being Human. Today we start a whole new segment of things. I've completed what I wanted to talk about in terms of what it is like to be a counselor and how you make your career choice to do that. But I want to start this new segment on relationships. And relationships can be based on so much, and there's so much to it that there'll be a lot to dig into. But first of all, let me describe a relationship as a connectedness that you have with another person. Sometimes it's a connectedness to a group. You have a relationship to groups, you have relationships to your family, but a relationship is your connectedness. It sometimes can be positive, it sometimes can be negative. And when we talk about relationships, I'm not talking just about sexual relationships. I'm talking about friendships. I'm talking about career development. I'm talking about how you relate with colleagues, how you relate with your children. So if you want to kind of have a list of the types of relationships that you can have, the first, I suppose, would be the relationship that you have with your spouse. The relationship that you have to your children. And remember, as you are having a relationship with them, they are having a relationship with you. So it's a two-sided thing, and we don't often think about that. We think about how we relate to our spouses, how we relate to our children. Then, of course, we have peer relationships. What about relationships from children to other children in the same family? Relationships of children to other children not in the same family. Siblings would be in the family, peers would be outside of the family. Relationships that we have with our colleagues and the people that we work with. Relationships that we have with people that are in church groups that are with us. Relationships that we have with people that we have hobbies with. Supposing you fly aircraft, you get to be friends with other people who fly aircraft. And so it involves an awful lot. And then, of course, you have to think of relationships just in general. How do you relate to the world? How do you relate to people that you don't even know? We sometimes feel that we can have a relationship with a person that we don't even know. Some people have that idea that they can do that. And to a certain degree, it's all based upon the perceptions that they have of what their relationships would be like if they knew that person. And so we have relationships also with our doctors, with our counselors. So relationships span a whole lot of things. And I also want to mention that relationships are based upon age and development. You don't expect a child to relate to an adult in the same way that they relate to another child. Due to the fact that children develop slowly over time and the brain develops slowly over time, the nature of their relationships can't be the same as an older child or a teenager or an adult or even an older adult. Every person has developmental stages that they go through from infancy on through the end of their life. I mean, if I were to teach a class in developmental psychology, and I used to teach classes like that, I would start from infancy. How does the baby relate to the other family members? How does the baby relate to an adult? What makes their relationship with them different? They do have a relationship, except if they're autistic. There's something about the autistic brain that cannot relate in a normal way. And so people who are autistic sometimes don't have relationships, or at least appears that they don't have relationships, because they can't communicate. Some people with autism don't even speak. And so their relationships with people are based on a whole different kind of thing than a child who can speak, a child who can walk and talk and is normal in every way. So you have to consider the person's age and their development, what their physical skills are, what their emotional skills are, how they're learning, what their mental development is in terms of the way that they learn and the way that they physically move and handle themselves. All of this is involved with relationships. So it gets to be a lot more complicated than what you might think. So whenever people are attached to another person, whenever you are attached to somebody else, you have a relationship with them. But you have to remember that you look at a relationship in a certain way, but other people involved in the relationship may not look at it the same way. For example, supposing a girl and a guy are dating, they've met each other, they like each other. What does the woman want? What does the girl want? Well, maybe she wants at some point to get married. Maybe she wants to have a home and family. Maybe her goal is to find the man of her dreams and have the White House and the picket fence and all of that. Maybe all of that is true. But the man may not look at that. He wants a companion. He wants to have somebody that he can go out with, have dinner with, go on a picnic with, and so forth, take walks with. And he doesn't want to be committed in any way except for that, a companionship. Now, as an aside, and I found this is interesting, when I did my years of counseling, and I've done years of counseling, I found that it's not like we expect. We expect the female to want to be married and want to move on in her life and get her man and get married and have her family and all of that. Perfectly natural, perfectly normal for the female to do that. And we're always told that the man wants to play the field, he doesn't want to commit, he doesn't want to settle down. But what I found when I counseled people who were thinking about marriage, college-age students and above, when they were thinking about marriage, the roles were reversed. It was the man who wanted to get married as soon as possible, and the lady, the woman, who said she wants to wait. She wanted to wait to find out whether it was really right. She didn't want to make a mistake. And I found considerable, what we would call today, role reversal in the fact that the man wanted to get married and the woman didn't want to get married. Now, all relationships have to be defined. And what I mean by that, if you're in a relationship, a friendship, or you're engaged, or even if you're married, or you're thinking about getting married, relationships need to be defined. When you have a relationship with somebody, you have hopes and you have dreams and you have expectations. By defining a relationship, you need to know, where is this relationship headed? Is it going to involve marriage? Is it going to be a friendship? Is that acceptable to both of you? You have to stop to think, what do you expect from a relationship? What do you expect from the person in the relationship? What do you want from them? What are they willing to give to you? What are you willing to give to them? What do they want of you? Defining a relationship is basically answering the question of, where is this relationship going? Should we see each other? How long should we see each other? Should we get married? Should we consider an engagement period? Or are we going to be friends and no more than friends? What is it supposed to be? And so we have to define that, because if you have two people in a relationship and they don't know the answer to these questions, then what's going to happen is that at some point the relationship will fail, because everyone is expecting a certain thing and the person that they're relating with isn't thinking that. So you have to get together with the person and find out how each one of you feels about important things. You know, and you don't have all of the answers at any one time. You may not be able to answer when you define a relationship whether it's going to lead to marriage or not. But what you can do is define where it leads you for now. Let's try meeting each other for a few weeks or a few months and see where it takes us. And then what you do is redefine and reevaluate the relationship again. So you've been together for a few months. What is it like? Now what do we want from each other? Can we envision being together for the rest of our lives? Or are we going to be splitting up because one of us wants to do one thing and one of us wants to do the other thing, and that we can't reconcile for that? So you have to have a defining thing in terms of your relationship, so you know where you're going, so you know where you're headed. And this is very, very important. I can give you an example. In terms of myself, I met him, I was working as, now we're talking about me as a college student. I was working in a hotel, a beachfront hotel, very nice oceanfront hotel. And there was a man there that was a guest. And we kind of got together. We liked each other. He was from Massachusetts. He was from Boston, basically. We liked each other. And we started going out with each other. And he was there for most of the summer. He had some difficult health problems, but he was there for most of the summer. And he enjoyed talking with me. I enjoyed talking with him and so forth. And we had kind of made plans. We tried to define the relationship, what we were going to do. At the end of the summer, I was going to stop working at the hotel, and I was going to go back to college. And he was going to go back to Massachusetts. So we made our plans. In that sense, we were defining the relationship. And what we said was, we'll get together every so often. I have friends in Boston. I could go to Boston and stay with them for a day or so here or there, then meet with him. We could go out to dinner. We could be together for a day, and then I could go back and stay with my friends at night. And then after a few days, I'd go back to the university where I was studying, and we could keep this up with letters and phone calls and so forth. And then after a certain period of time, find out where we were going from that point. And that was acceptable to both of us, and that would work out well because now we have a plan of action. We're not trying to commit to a marriage. We're not trying to say we'll be together forever. But for now, what do we want? For the next few weeks, what do we want? Well, after a while, I didn't hear from him. And I was concerned because of his health problems. And then I decided, well, he's just lost interest in me. And that was okay. I had plenty to keep myself busy. And then I heard from his mother, who called me, he had died. He had actually passed away. And so, of course, that changes my ground rules considerably. There's no getting together with him. His mother was very happy that we had been together. I helped him over some bad things, and she thanked me for being there for him. We didn't realize that he was going to die. He died of some of his health problems. We didn't realize he was going to die. We thought that the health problems were not insurmountable. We could work with them. We could be together if that's what we wanted to do. But he passed on. Now, if you have to, and I'm going to do a special segment on this later on, if you have to lose somebody moves away, maybe there's a divorce, somebody changes jobs and moves away, somebody passes away, you have to have closure. If you don't have closure, your grief can last for months and months and months and months. You have to have closure, whether it's the loss of a job that you loved or the loss of a person that you loved, not necessarily in death, but there are all kinds of ways to have losses. A person moves away, a person changes job, a person loses interest. There's all kinds of ways to have losses. And we've already talked about in other segments what it is like for a person who is seeing a counselor to lose the counselor because they're being dismissed because they no longer need to see them. And there's trauma in that. There's always trauma in terms of loss and separation. And there's always grief that results from that. So when I found out that he had died, and I talked with his mother, and he had talked to his mother about me, and she wanted me in his life, and it was a help to him to have me in his life. And so as I talked to her, I realized, I was personally devastated by this. We had plans, and the plans would never come to fruition. So I had to get closure, and what I did was I went back to Boston. And I stayed with my friends for a few days, and we did the touristy things that you do when you're in a big city. We went out to the restaurants, and we went out to the shopping malls, and, taking dinner, taking a movie, and all of that. We did the usual things, but before I left to go back to the university, one of my friends took me to where he died. And they didn't want to do it. They thought, it's going to be too much for you to see where he died, because we had grown quite close. And I said, but I really need to do this. I need to see where he was when he died. And so they took me to where he died. And I had the experience of being there, being in the surroundings where he passed on. And that was enough to give me closure so I could get forward with my life. Because otherwise, if you don't have that closure, you will be hung up on the grief. It's like when you have closure, you draw the curtain. Okay, this is done. Now we can go forward. If you are in a grief experience, And that's with a person that you've had a relationship with, either for a short or long period of time. If you're in that kind of a relationship and there's grief involved, or there's a separation, if you don't have the closure, that grief lingers, and it can linger for years. A lot of the people that I counseled, when I counseled them, they were suffering really from grief-induced depression. Because if you have a lot of grief, that can move into depression. Now, there is a difference between grief and depression, and we'll be getting into that as time goes on. There's quite a difference, but one can lead to the other. And then when you get into the depressive phase, it's very hard to get out of it. So I took and had the closure by going to the city where he was, by visiting the place where he died, and then after that, you feel better. You don't think you're going to. When you are trying to get closure, you don't think that you're going to feel better because you're kind of going over the agony of that grief. It's like a funeral. If you go to a funeral, if the funeral is a good funeral, if the funeral is adequate to your needs, you will find that it will act as a closure for you. And if you are still so grief-stricken after the funeral that you can't manage your grief very well, and you're starting to go into a clinical depression, which would be the next step, or a major depression, which would be the next step, then the funeral was not adequate in some kind of way. I mean, I've gone into funerals that were very good, and they gave the closure that was needed. I've gone into other funerals that were not very good and did not give the closure that was needed. And if you're in a situation where you don't get that closure, you will still feel the grief. There is something called grief work. Grief work is when you're sorting out in your mind, resolving the grief, getting it over with, getting it packaged up, so to speak, drawing the curtain around it so that it's no longer there to haunt you. It doesn't mean that you won't have times of grief. It doesn't mean that you won't have times of tears, but it does mean that you're not haunted by it. It's not on your mind day in and day out, and that you can respond in your life as a normal person as you usually do. You can go out with your friends, you can attend to your responsibilities, and you're not destroyed by the grief. And gradually the grief lessens with time. Without that closure, you never have an end to it. I suppose in a way you'd have an end as years go down the line, but you can have years of suffering before that happens, and you want to get it done. So if you're having a relationship with somebody and something happens and that relationship does not continue, then you need to have the closure from that to move on. So there are many types of relationships, and they're good and some of them are bad. The thing that you have to remember is the developmental phases and how that plays into relationships. And I want to mention this about children. Do young children relate? Well, of course they do. You get an infant, a few weeks old, they're smiling at their mother. When the mother comes in and talks to them, they start grinning and they start smiling. Well, that's the beginning of the relationship with the parent. And the parent already has a relationship with the child. I think the relationship begins in utero before the baby is born. A lot of women talk about being attached to their babies. They've never seen them. They haven't given birth yet, but they're still attached to their babies. There is just something about the human being that needs to have attachments to people. People who don't have attachments are usually mentally ill. One of the signs of mental illness is that people cannot attach to other people. But of course, you've got to remember, if you're going to have a relationship, you're going to be at a certain point vulnerable. If I have a relationship with somebody that I care about, that means that I have to be vulnerable enough to be stepped on. I have to be vulnerable enough to endure the pain should that person leave by their own choice or maybe not by their own choice. But I have to be vulnerable to have a relationship. That can be painful. And one of the things that happens in relationships is people who have been hurt we'll make the decision not to have relationships. I'll never fall in love again. I hear that all the time. I'll never fall in love again. I'll never have a relationship with another human being again. I'm going to be by myself, and I'm going to take care of myself, and nobody else is going to matter except me, and therefore I won't be hurt. If I'm not hurt, then I can live without grief. And the idea is to get away from that hurt. But part of being a human being is to allow yourself to be in somebody else's life and allow that person to be in your life, so there's an interchange. And when you have that interchange, then you are bound at some point to be vulnerable if something happens. Now, I mentioned children. I want to get back to that for a moment. Children do something that's called parallel play. They can play beside each other, but not with each other. This would happen at ages, let's say 18 months to maybe 2.5 years or so, where a child and another child, they look like they're playing together, but they're really not. They just happen to be beside each other, and each one is playing with their own thing. They're not interacting with each other. They just happen to be in each other's presence. You take two young children, you put them in a playground, you put them in a sandbox. One of them has a shovel, the other has a toy truck. One is playing with the shovel, the other's playing with the toy truck. But are they playing with each other, really? They're not talking to each other. They're not saying, I'll take my shovel and I'll put sand in the back of your truck. Then you can ride your truck around and then we'll take sand out of it. They're not interacting with each other. They just happen to be beside each other as they're playing with their own individual toy. That's called parallel play. Now, it is the beginning of something important, because what's going to happen is they get a little older, 3.5 to 4, they start interacting. You can't have that truck, it belongs to me. I don't want this shovel, I want your truck. Or they make kind of a pact with each other. You play with your truck and I'll put sand in your truck. And at that point, they're interacting with each other, and what you have is the beginning of a relationship between two young children, because they're now talking to each other. They're now looking at each other. They're now watching what each other is doing. And they may not have a lot of language skills yet. They may be too young for that. But they point and they say things as much as they're able to, and they do things. I'll toss the ball to you. You toss the ball back to me. And gradually as they grow, they get more and more interactive with time. And by the time they're 5 or 6, they can play games together, they can talk with each other, they can argue with each other as to who's going to have a toy. I saw the most interesting thing. I was in a medical office. I was doing a consultation with somebody, and I waited for my appointment for this consultation, and 2 young children were playing, and one child grabbed another child's toy, and the other child just started to talk about psychodynamics. How would you feel if I took your toy away from you? Now, you wouldn't feel very good if I took your toy away. You shouldn't take my toy away. And he's very rational, I suspect very, very smart. And he was trying to describe his feelings to the other child, and the other child should be respectful of his feelings and not do anything that would hurt his feelings, because he would not hurt the other child's feelings. And you'd think that this child was 4 or 5 years older to understand the psychodynamics of it. The other little boy could have cared less. He wanted the toy, he was going to play with the toy, and that was all there was to it. But there was an attempt at interaction. And that's really important, to have that attempt at interaction. Well, I think we'll close it here. There's an awful lot more to talk about, and we'll get into this. And I think it'll be interesting as I go. I think what I'll do is I'll talk about what makes relationships work, what is something, what are the things that make relationships not work, and get into the positive and the negative of relationships. And then what we want to talk about, mental conditions and what that does to a relationship. Maybe you are married to somebody who has an emotional problem and it affects the way that they relate to you. Remember, you're relating to somebody, but they're relating back to you, and their perception of the relationship may be a lot different than yours is, and that's why relationships need to be defined. So we want to get into all of that, and then I'm going to take it from young childhood up and talk about the relationships and how they are in different ages with different developments. And this is important for parents to know, because it makes all the difference in the world in understanding why your child is doing what they're doing and what that means in terms of his development. So this is the beginning of something new. I hope you enjoy it. We'll continue next time. Please join me then.